Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome everybody to today's briefing on the Keeping All Students Safe Act. Our briefing is sponsored today by Appraise, the Alliance to Prevent Restraint, Aversives, and Seclusion in Schools. I'm Denise Marshall, CEO for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, or COPA. We co-chair the Appraise Coalition with our partner, the National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN. We want to welcome our Hill champions who have led the introduction of the Keeping All Students Safe Act in the U.S. Congress. Before I turn to the senators who are joining with us today, I do want to thank the House members who have led on this issue for years but are unable to join us today. Representative Don Beyer from Virginia, Chairman Bobby Scott from Virginia, and Representative Donald McEachin from Virginia. Thank you to this awesome trio, and thank you the 96 senators and congressmen and women who have signed on as co-sponsors of this legislation to date. To start today, we will first have a short video from Chair Patty Murray, who we know is a true partner in promoting safe and inclusive schools. She couldn't join us today, but she prepared a short video. Senator Murray currently serves as the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and is also the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee that oversees education funding. Senator Murray is a tireless leader and advocate for children and families, including our children, students with disabilities, students of color, and other marginalized students. We truly appreciate her commitment to ending the use of seclusion and restraint in our nation's schools.
Hi, I'm Senator Patty Murray, and I am incredibly honored to join you all in this critical conversation on the need to pass the Keeping All Students Safe Act to ensure no student gets secluded or inappropriately restrained at school. Every single student deserves to be safe at school, full stop. But the horrifying reality is that across the country, schools are still allowed to punish students by locking them in rooms or forcibly restraining them in dangerous and sometimes deadly ways. And it is clear from the data, because of systemic ableism and racism, it is students with disabilities, students of color, and boys who are suffering the most harm from these practices. It is completely unacceptable that in 2021, it is still legal for schools to engage in such violent practices, which we know are extremely traumatizing for our students. That is why I'm working hard to pass the Keeping All Students Safe Act to finally put an end to those dangerous practices and ensure every student feels safe and secure while at school. This legislation would ban dangerous restraint practices restricting children's breathing, make it illegal for any school receiving federal taxpayer money to seclude children, and provide training for educators to use evidence-based, safe de-escalation strategies. Our kids are counting on us to ensure that their school environment is free from harm. So I'm going to keep fighting tooth and nail to get this critical legislation across the finish line. Thank you.
And thank you, Senator Murray, for your tireless advocacy. You certainly nailed it right on the head when you said it's systemic ableism and racism that continues this practice. We know a better way, and it's time we used it in our nation's schools. I now have the honor of introducing Senator Chris Murphy, who has represented the state of Connecticut in the U.S. Senate since 2013. Senator Murphy is a lawyer by training, and his work Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, as well as the Appropriations Committee, sets him apart as an influential and leading voice for students with disability and their families. His legislative work includes placing significant focus on ending exclusionary discipline practices and promoting safe and healthy school climates. He is with us today as the lead author and critical Senate champion of the Keeping All Students Safe Act. Senator Murphy, we've got to stop meeting like this. I hope soon that this bill is passed and that we no longer have to have briefings and convince people that now is the time to take action. Thank you again for being with us today.
This is an issue that we've been talking about in Connecticut for a long time. It was about 9 years ago where a series of exposés were done about so-called scream rooms or scream closets in an elementary school in Middletown, Connecticut. Rooms that the janitors would have to go in at the end of the day and clean blood off the walls and urine off the floor because children were being put in a concrete closet when they were acting out. Come to find out that this was a practice being used all over our state and all over the country. And of course, as we began to collect more and more data, unsurprisingly, we find that it was a practice, both the practice of seclusion and restraint being used predominantly on disabled students and more often on students of color. Listen, for me, there's just a bright line. No student should ever be locked in a closet, locked in a room by themselves. That is bad practice. That is unhealthy. That is not helping the student, nor is it building a positive climate in that school. And when it comes to restraints, there are moments where there is absolutely no other option, but those moments are limited. And there are plenty of other interventions that can be used before a restraint is ever necessary. But right now, I want to be honest with you, teachers need help. Administrators need help. And so we should pass this legislation, but we should also acknowledge that right now we need more resources in our schools to help teachers and administrators deal with an increasing number of kids post-pandemic who are showing up with traumas and behavior issues. I was in elementary school all morning last week in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where about 7% of the kids hit state mandated test scores. And I listened to the early childhood educators there tell me how different their job is after the pandemic compared to before the pandemic, how social isolation for so many of these kids has caused children to show up way behind the curve when it comes to interpersonal skills and social emotional skills. And we should never put a teacher in the position where the only thing they can do is to restrain, physically harm a child who is acting out. We've got to deliver them the sort of education and the training and the tools to find a different path, but also the resources, the paraprofessionals that can help in these situations. So let's pass this legislation, but let's also understand that we need to provide a broader set of tools and capacities for our educators. So again, thanks for letting me help kick this off. I'm the parent of two public school kids, two urban public school kids. I'm married to a former legal aid lawyer who spent much of her career representing the kids we're talking about, kids in the juvenile justice system. And so I'm eager to use this opportunity we have with a compassionate House, a compassionate Senate, and a president who believes in our mission to get this done. So look forward to hearing the outcome of your discussions today.
Thank you so much, Senator Murphy. Again, on the behalf of the Appraise Coalition, we really appreciate you being here. And again, thank you for your commitment to children.
Thank you.
Before I move on and introduce our esteemed panel, I want to just again reiterate what both Senators Murphy and Murray stated this morning. We need CASA because every child should be safe at school. There are hundreds of thousands of students who are restrained or secluded, and sadly, some of those same students are secluded or restrained hundreds and hundreds of times each year. Every child should be safe and protected at school, and where a child lives should determine if they receive an education. Let's face it, if a child is in crisis and teachers are in crisis, and a child is being held down by many staff persons or locked alone in a room, they are not being educated. They are being traumatized, and sometimes they are being hurt. So again, we want to be sure that we pass this legislation that protects all students, although we know that 78% of the students, according to a Government Accountability Office study, are students with disabilities and students of color. So students that we represent and protect at COPA are, 3 to 4 times more likely to be restrained or secluded at school than other students. But we still need a bill to protect all of them. Some states have no state laws, so we need to make sure we, include those states in a federal law.
Denise is frozen, so I'm just going to pick up where she left off, if that's okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Okay, when Denise comes back, we will bring her back. The bill numbers are in the chat, and wanted to make sure we did reaffirm who our House sponsors of the bill are. We're very appreciative to Representative Don Beyer, Chair Scott, and Donald McEachin, who are all from the state of Virginia. They are the House sponsors of the bill, and you've heard from the 2 Senate senators. We are going to introduce the panel now. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to briefly go through your quick part of your bios. We are going to put your full bios up on the StopHurtingKids.com website, but we're going to start with Sam. Sam, thank you for joining us today. You describe yourself as a self-advocate who's against the use of restraint and seclusion, and we get to hear from you today in a few minutes. Sam was diagnosed with autism at age 3, and he was restrained when he was just 5 years old until he was 14. And now he's a successful photographer, and he has a mission in life to shift the way people think about autism from awareness to acceptance. And so, Sam, welcome today. Next is Julie Weiner, a self-advocate as well. He's a writer, graduate student. Julie, we have lots to talk about offline. We share some writing goals there, and a disability rights advocate from Philadelphia. She's lived with a chronic pain and fatigue condition and uses a wheelchair part-time. She's dedicated herself to disability advocacy since the age of 4. And we get to hear about, that. We welcome you today, Julie. We know you work with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in hopes that the next generation of students will not have to experience what you have. Angie Zara is a 4th grade classroom teacher. Hi, Angie. Thank you for joining us from the Washington, D.C. area. She has focused her career on understanding and implementing trauma-responsive, relationship-centered practices in education, and she works to cultivate, lead, and implement trauma-informed practices among teachers and students. And we're so excited to have you here with us, Angie. Victoria Johnson is a parent from North Dakota. She founded Families United for Self-Empowerment and helps connect families to the resources that they need in her community and in her state. And she's also here because her son was restrained at the age of 10 by a school resource officer. And she's an active member of COPA, and we're excited that she is here to tell us more about her work and her family's experience. Heidi O'Leary is the Director of Special Education for the Maine School Administrative District 75. And Heidi's worked with students with disabilities for over 29 years. She also teaches at the university there in Farmington, Maine, and she teaches transition for youth with disabilities and instructs special educators, which is such an amazing thing to be able to help reduce the use of physical restraint while you're, instructing the next generation of teachers. And then Dan Stewart is with us as legal director of the Minnesota Disability Law Center, part of the Minnesota Legal Aid and Minnesota's designated federal protection and advocacy organization. The PNAs are located, as we know, in each state. And thank you, Dan, for being here as a legal expert, as an advocate for children with disabilities and their families. Denise, are you back with us? I'm going to turn the time back to you if you're good, and we'll start with the questions that I know you want to discuss with the panel.
I am back with us, and thank you for jumping in. I hope I'm not going to get booted out again. But if I do, I know you'll take over very expertly. So again, yes, thank you to all the panelists. I think we have an exciting day here. And I know that Julie and Sam shared with me their excitement to share their stories, really their need to share their story. So we appreciate their willingness to do so, because I know what and they and Victoria's son and staff persons in schools, it's traumatizing to everyone who is involved in restraint and seclusion incidents. So let me turn it over to Sam first for the first question. Sam, I know you shared with me earlier that you have thought about and written what you wanted to say to share some traumatizing events when you were in school. If I can turn it over to you to share that with us and maybe talk a little bit about your journey then to become a self-advocate.
Yeah. So I was diagnosed with autism at age 3, and I was restrained as young as 5, and all the way up until 2014 when I got out of school, when I was pulled out by my mom. I would like to share you with a story with you today. Thanks, Guy, and everyone here today, and for inviting me to speak about my experience with restraint and seclusion. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that. Hello, my name is Sam Maloney, and I'm from Rochester, New York. I'm here today to speak about my experience with restraint and seclusion as a person with autism. It's really hard. It all started in 2007 when I was kicked out in 2nd grade. My principal was a very kind lady, but she was replaced with someone who was much less sympathetic and understanding of my needs. They kicked me out and I got sent to another school. This situation was made worse when my mom was diagnosed with cancer that year. I could and couldn't advocate for me. My first restraint was also in 2nd grade. At that new school, I was restrained every single day, getting put in a prone position, and even getting grabbed by my hands and feet, thrown into unpadded seclusion rooms. I almost got concussion because of how roughly I was treated there. In 2013, I got transferred again. I was at a new school for a year. I could actually hear other students screaming throughout the hallways. I can't express to you guys how horrifying it was. It was very horrifying to hear those screams of those students. I was coming home with scratches, bruises, and abrasions all over my body. I'm shaking just reading this. I tried telling my bus drivers what happened to me, but they wouldn't believe me. I would cry in the morning saying to my mom, "Mom, I don't want to go to school." My only coping mechanism was to sleep all day until I could go home. I slept on the floor for a year at that school. I learned nothing. I gained no skills. I did not grow. I just retreated into myself. I thought I was going to die there. This nightmare only ended in 2014 when my mom walked into school and saw me scared and surrounded by 5 adult staff members. I looked at her and she looked at me and she says, "Get away from my son." They backed away and she put me into her car. I was so shocked and terrified that I sat in the fetal position in the car. The staff members actually tried to follow us and physically pull me out of the car and put me into that school again. Not every kid with autism is able to get out, and it happens all over this country, including my friends I have in other states.
It's okay, Sam, take your time.
Maybe I can inspire others to speak up as well. I don't think this should happen to anyone, and I don't think this should happen to anyone. It's been going on for a long time, and speaking for students who has experienced restraint and seclusion just because they need a little extra support. Maybe I can inspire the others to speak up as well. One thing for sure, I will live with this trauma for the rest of my life, and it shouldn't happen to anyone. Thanks, everyone here today for inviting me to speak about my experience with autism. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I echo what a lot of people are writing in the comments, which is that they really appreciate you sharing your story, that you're brave, and that we agree that should not have happened to you. And hopefully we're going to be able to work together to stop it from happening to other students. Thank you again. Keep an eye on those chat comments because people are talking to you and they appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to turn next to Julie, who also is a self-advocate and someone who had the unfortunate experiences of being secluded and restrained when she was younger. So Julie, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened with you and how those experiences may have, affected your education and your ability to trust adults?
Yes, absolutely. So I was a perfectly normal, just physically disabled child in the neighborhood school until my third grade teacher decided I was lazy and needed to be punished for that. So I went to a different school in the district that had an emotional support program that was actually a behavioral support program, which used restraint and seclusion. The restraint and seclusion is not only physical torture, but psychological torture. A lot of it happened when my physical limitations from my disability interfered with my ability to do schoolwork. So I have severe back problems that manifest when I'm fatigued. But if I wasn't sitting up and demonstrating that I was paying attention, the teachers in my self-contained emotional support classroom would stop the lesson to address that behavior, pinning me upright in my seat and hurting me. And when that inevitably escalated, I was being disruptive and had to go to the cool down room, which is what they called one of two padded cells they had down the hall. There, I would finish off my dysregulated episode, too tired to do anything else, rinse and repeat. I was so used to being punished when the limitations of my physical disability impacted my schoolwork that I had to learn how to advocate for myself all over again and learn how to trust that my needs will be met. Even though I've rarely been treated with such disregard since my ordeal, to this day, whenever I ask for necessary extensions on something or even for clarification, I'm afraid that even my wonderful professors and my amazing supervisor, who are so kind and patient and understanding, will turn on me. I'm afraid that even though we have had no problems when my chronic illness dominates my schedule, that one day I will have asked for too much. I no longer struggle with asking. That used to be a real challenge, but only when I receive an affirming answer to a long-winded request for mercy can I relax. The adults in the accommodating private school that I attended from the grades 7 through 12 all became intimately familiar with my trauma in order to handle me, and most were up to the challenge. But among other impacts, I couldn't even sit in a math class until 11th grade because learning math was so triggering for me. I had to do it with a one-on-one tutor who could work with me at my very slow pace. Whenever things got too overwhelming for me to handle, I would elope to the nearest bathroom to self-regulate, and I did this from the end of 4th grade until 2 days before I graduated high school. I still struggle with self-harm, not to the degree that I did in my teens, but enough. So how am I here 3/4 of a way done with a master's degree? I'm running on spite and privilege. Everything I do is to spite my tormentors, particularly the principal of my 6th grade school who violently restrained and secluded me on 2 separate occasions. But I've made it this far because of privilege. First and foremost, the privilege of educated parents who understood my rights, the privilege of financial capital to hire specialists and lawyers that got the school district to fund my education and services elsewhere, the privilege of proximity to a school more suited to my needs, and access to extensive therapy. And I owe everything to my parents who are both here today because I've always been able to trust them and they have always been able to provide what I needed when no one else could or would.
Thank you so much, Julie, for sharing your story. And I know both you and Sam mentioned your parents and the important role that they played in getting the restraint and seclusion to end and getting you the services that you need. So a shout out to all the families. And we're going to hear from Victoria, who's a parent of a young son in just a little bit. So thank you again for sharing of your story. And when you shared your adjective, somebody wrote in the thing resiliency too. That's another trait that allowed you to keep moving forward. So thank you again. So Angie, I want to ask you, as a fourth grade classroom teacher, you've heard both Sam and Julie share their traumatizing experiences. Tell about the culture of your classroom and how you're able to teach and support students who may be struggling with managing their feelings or, exhibiting behaviors that might be inappropriate for school or disruptive.
Absolutely. First of all, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. First, before I respond, I just want to say, Sam and Julie, thank you so much for your courage. On behalf of teachers, educators, advocates of children, I apologize, and I am so sorry that you had that experience. And I hope that we are in a better place now where there are teachers who see poor practices such as those and actively disrupt those, no matter what repercussions may occur, knowing that those are still occurring in school. So thank you so much for sharing. In regards to speaking about the culture of my school and classroom, I am a fourth grade teacher in a full inclusion Title I school in Ward 4 in Washington, D.C., teaching extremely diverse, both culturally and academically diverse students, predominantly students of color, specifically Latinx and Black students. My classroom culture is rooted in understanding the lived experiences of students as they enter my space, understanding their diverse needs, their diverse backgrounds, and rooted in restorative and trauma-informed practices, as well as an expectation for high accountability for the impact of our behaviors and actions on our community members, both on our classroom level and our school level. And I don't think that there's any student in my classroom that cannot meet the high expectations given a supportive and safe learning environment. And I have been proven that to be true throughout my 6-year career at this school. I do teach students with disabilities, including students with autism, and I have seen them thrive and grow in my classroom and have seen immense growth with those students in my school and in my classroom. There are several ways to teach and support students who have diverse behavior and academic challenges. We know through research that there are trauma-informed and best practices to first seek to understand the students that are entering your space and their lived experiences, their diverse needs, and then partnering with their families to better understand their whole experience as they enter your classroom community. I seek to lead with relationship building, one-on-one relationship building, classroom community relationship building, and family engagement, as well as understanding cultural differences and consistently reflecting on my own internal biases as a white presenting biracial woman born and raised in Washington, D.C., and what experience and implications that might bring to my practice. There are also other research-based strategies to manage students who have behavior deemed inappropriate for school. Just like we have students enter our space who have different reading and math challenges, we have students entering our space with different behavioral needs, social emotional challenges, and the need to learn skills proactively to meet those challenges in both the classroom, the school, and ultimately the goal to set students up to thrive in society, no matter where they come from. So some of those strategies and practices are the prioritization of teacher wellness, as well as student wellness in terms of mental health supports for teachers and students, strategic differentiated instruction to meet the needs of individual learners, specific scaffolds that could be social and emotional scaffolds and coping strategies, math scaffolds and coping strategies or approaches to learning, really just when we think about learners entering our space, we're not expecting a compliant one-size-fits-all learner to come into our room. And so it's really important that we seek to understand how those students are entering our space and what we can do to strategically set students up for success. Also thinking about accommodations for understanding the needs of diverse learners. Julie, just speaking about your experience, the fact that you were asked to sit up tall to show that you're compliantly understanding, grade level content, that is a behavior rooted in an archaic educational system that actually doesn't represent how well you're attaining knowledge. And I'm just so sorry that that happened to you. And Sam, I'm sure that you are a brilliant learner with so many strengths. And I'm so sorry that as early as 5 years old that your teachers and administrators did not see your brilliant strengths that I'm sure that you were bringing into your classroom. I think it's important to address that there are not necessarily behaviors that are inappropriate for school, but that everyone is coming in with a different background and experience based on how they came into the world and how they experienced the world. And any behavior, just like any academic skill, should be met as a team with caregivers, stakeholders, related service providers, with strategic supports in targeted areas for those specific learners. And unfortunately, seclusion and restraint are forced physical contact that serve no constructive healing, restorative, or reflective purposes. In my 6-year career teaching students with varied behavioral challenges and academic and behavioral learning needs, there has never been the need to restrain a student. The only physical touch that I have had with a student and people on my team have been a consensual hug, fist bump, handshake, or high five.
I have to unmute myself. I'm saying wow, and thank you. Your clear, concise affirmation of what can be done and should be done for students was resonating with many of our participants, and really music to my ears, because it's, as you said, it can be done. We know how to do it. And educators, I think the big resounding question that some were asking is, how do we make sure that other educators begin to view their classrooms and have what they need to build a space, as you called it, or community that is supportive of everyone that's there? And in particular, I know one of the participants asked, how do we do that for students who are of color, students who are Black, students who, may be otherwise marginalized? Any thoughts on that before I turn to Angie? I mean, Victoria, you're Angie.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, I think when it comes to the educational system, especially emerging from a pandemic and the, racial reckoning that we came to terms with as a society in 2020, that we re-emerged or came back to, right? Because that inequity always existed. I think it just requires some deep, consistent chipping away at systemic challenges, such as teacher wellness, student wellness, the prioritization of mental health, and reflection on educational inequities that have been perpetuated and existed within the system for a very long period of time. And so I think it requires some changes to our system, some intentional supports for teachers and for students, and extensive training and reflection. And if those things are prioritized the same way that standardized testing is prioritized in our system, I think that we could make some really impactful changes.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. And while we're working on those systemic changes, lots of folks know if we could also clone you, so we can get more teachers in the schools right now. So, all right. Thank you. And Victoria, let me move on to you. Thank you for being here from North Dakota and for sharing your family's experience. I know that your 10-year-old son was secluded and restrained in school without your knowledge. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what your journey was like?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Victoria Johnson. I'm in Fargo, North Dakota. My son, at 10 years old, he was secluded and restrained. My son called me. It was out of nowhere. He called me and said, "Mom, come pick me up." I went to the school. He said his chest was hurting. So I arrived to the school and my son had bloody elbow. His wrist was just, skins was all ripped, teared. And I stood there and I asked the teacher what happened. And they told me they didn't know what happened. And that they need to call the proper person to come in and talk to me. As my son, he's autistic, he has autism and he has asthma. And he's walking me through what happened. And out of nowhere, as we're talking, about 5 or 6 police officers just showed up and tell me, "Step aside, ma'am, we're here to arrest your son." Nobody told me what happened. I literally had no idea what's going on. What did he do? What kind of crime did he commit? And so I'm standing here in the room and I realized I have to stay calm. And so they took my son to jail. He's only 10, took him to detention center. I went and visit my son and I asked what happened. And he told me he did not want to go to class with one of his male teachers. He wanted to be in a classroom with one of his female teacher because he had just that connection with that teacher. And if you understand kids with autism, they build that connection. And when they have somebody they really enjoy being in their class, that's who they want. And that's really what happened. So he told me he just wanted to be in that teacher's room and they told him no. And they decided to drag him into this, they call it the calming room, and drag him into this room and placed him in prone restraint position. My son was secluded for 26 minutes and was placed in a prone restraint position, was handcuffed. As all this is happening, all these things was all on a video. On top of it, all this, my son was charged criminally. And it was the worst nightmare a mother can go through, to see your child inside a jail with kids who are up to 18 years old. And he was the youngest kid that detention center ever seen. They were scared for his life. They tried to take my son and brought him to a mental health facility because they said he's too young to be here. But the mental health facility cannot take him unless he's danger to himself or he's danger to somebody else, to the community, and he was not. So because of it, they couldn't take my son. So my son had to go back to this detention center until we go to court the next day in front of a judge. And when my son looked at me and told me, "Mom, I didn't do anything," I believed him because I always taught my son, my kids, both of them, always be honest with me. I don't care how bad it is. I will protect you and I will help you. But if you lie to me, I can't help you. So he told me exactly what happened. And my journey was a long journey. I had to go through the court proceeding, the state of North Dakota. After I refused to take a plea deal from a juvenile justice, the state of North Dakota decided to formally charge my son. And I had to hire a private lawyer. Affected me financially, mentally, and emotionally. But I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that justice was served, that my son did not do what they claimed he did. My son still lived with that trauma, nightmares. After filing a state complaint, winning a state complaint, winning the case court, and they could not find a proof or evidence that my son did anything wrong. After court proceeding, the video came out, and when they watched it, they could not believe what they saw. They dismissed the case against my son. And that's when I realized that I needed to come public with my story. And I went public with my story. And when I did that, I realized there were so many kids like my son. And that is just overwhelming. And so I decided to start the nonprofit organization, start helping family, using my own personal experience, my journey, and how I work to help my kid, to help other families. And that is something I cannot imagine. When Sam, you were talking about your experience, I almost cried because you remind me of my son. There were times my son told me, I want to die. My son almost commits suicide at 10 years old. He just wants to take his life. He ended up in a mental institution for almost 2 to 3 weeks because my son almost took his life because he just can't. The trauma was so much, he couldn't handle it. And that's experience that I will not wish on anybody, not even my enemy. I will never wish what my son went through on my enemy. I won't, because I had to watch my son every night, scared. Is he going to take his life? I stay up at night sometimes to just make sure he does not do something to take his life. So I understand that fear and I understand that pain, Sam. I feel it.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for sharing your story. And again echo the comments in the chat box of people who are horrified, who cannot believe. Although we hear the tale all too often, as you said, it happens to many, many students. And as I said earlier, it happens to students who are of color and students with disabilities 3 to 4 times, sometimes 5 times more than it happens to any other group of students, particularly in calling the police. One of the ways this bill certainly addresses or tries to address this issue by providing training, not only in understanding different disabilities, but includes resource officers in the requirements of the bill. I know that Victoria and Sam both mentioned prone restraints. For those of you who don't know, that means that the student is held face down on the floor, often by 4 or 5 individuals. As you said, your son was handcuffed to keep him in that position. And there are often, as the student is traumatized, ridiculous requests for them to comply with to be allowed out of that situation. So again, I hope that for you and for Julie and for Sam, sharing your stories is helpful and cathartic on the road to recovery, but also helps us draw this bright line in federal legislation to protect kids. One thing I also want to mention is that Senator Murphy is the champion of the Counseling Not Criminalization bill, which we are also in support of because we do need to move away from communities that in schools that continue to be hierarchical and punitive, and more towards the type of classroom that Angie described earlier, and that I think we're going to hear from Heidi as well. She's our next panelist and has led her school to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion, and I understand is doing a phenomenal job at that. And I was hoping you'd share with us a little more about that journey and how training has helped.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And the stories are remarkable, and I'm so brave to be able to come on here and talk about them. So yeah, I am the special education director in Topsom, Maine. And I've been in the district that I'm currently in now since 2017. And when I came in, we had an incident with seclusion and really was very, very upsetting. And so we decided we needed to do something different. And can you hear me okay? My internet seems to be unstable. So I think that, what I'd like to share with you is that how to make a difference or how to change this and how the training has really, really made a difference is it comes from the buy-in from staff who really have to agree to that there's a better way than using hands-on practices with children. And then going on and training them what to do instead really became the impetus of change. Overall, to reduce restraint and seclusion, what a district or a school must make a commitment to doing this and not using restraint or seclusion. You really have to have that commitment and buy-in. So as an administrator, I also needed to set the expectation with my staff to learn different strategies, but also I needed to provide a lot of support while this change is happening. And we're still making changes. We've made a lot of gains, but we still are working towards, zero restraint, zero seclusion. But it's all really about changing the mindset as this happens. And the biggest thing, really, when you're changing mindset is patience, because this isn't going to happen overnight. And there is still going to be bumps in the road as you move forward with this, but you just need to keep going and you need to deal with things as they come, but you need to keep your mission in sight, that you do not want to put hands on kids and that you do not want to seclude children. So that's that part of that. Do you want me to keep going? Yeah, okay. So why would a federal, whoops, didn't hear you. Okay, great, thank you. So in Maine recently, we had a law change, LD 1373 was proposed and accepted. And so how a federal law of not putting restraint and seclusion in IEPs would help us to do better. In Maine, that's already in place, and it became in place, changed on October 18th. In my current district, we've never put that into IEPs, so it hasn't really been an issue. But really, I thought about this a lot, and really what it should say is, the question should ask, well, to be more proactive is, what are you going to do instead of using restraint and seclusion? And then what do I want the Congress to know about your understanding of why a federal law is needed? So my thought on that, in practice even, is I would like you to know that federal law would mandate that other methods must be used. There's just no question about that. While I understand that intervention methods are taught through various programs to de-escalate students so that you're always using the less restrictive intervention, unfortunately, though, sometimes it's taken as, well, I have the training, so if I see that it's dangerous, then I can use this approach. So it almost gives them the assurance that they can use it rather than thinking of something different. Additionally, Maine recently also again changed their law and made regulations even more restrictive than they were before. So it helps really for me to emphasize why we absolutely must do something different. Now I have that backing of that. So we'd already been in the process of changing our practices. So this shift wasn't as difficult when this law came into effect, but it also gave us the backing that we needed to make this happen. And we aren't going to put hands on kids or seclude them. And why we're doing this is we're doing this because we're doing it for the safety of all children and the dignity of the children and everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership. And I think you said it well. It's a mindset. It takes not only the training and the knowledge of how to do other things and perhaps the time to chat and think with each other, but the emphasis on what to do instead is critical. And we at COPA, since 2009, when the CASA bill passed the House but did not pass the Senate because they wanted to leave restraint and seclusion in IEPs, and we said absolutely no, because we know that's the sentence for its continual use. And what should be in there instead, as you said, is not only how to prevent it, but what does that student like to do instead? What do they need to learn? What skills do they need to learn? What strategies work with them? What strategies help support them and calm them? The goal should always be to have them regain control and not to exert control over them. And I think that's exactly what you just reinforced for us. Great, thank you. All right. I'm now going to turn over to Dan Stewart, who's an attorney from Minnesota, I believe. Did I get that right? And part of the National Disability Rights Network. Each state is required to have a protection and advocacy organization. And so Dan's organization is the P&A, as I don't know if they still call them that, but in Minnesota. And, we also at COPA have a fair amount of attorneys and advocates who work on this issue. And as Victoria stated, and Julie, I know that, each of you needed to bring in attorneys to help you work on this issue. So the stories that were articulated by Sam and by Julie and Victoria.
Dan, Denise is frozen. I think she's trying to get at. Tell us more.
Sadly, they are not alone. They are just the tip of the iceberg. From your perspective, pass a federal one. Oops. Well,
Yeah, Denise, you got a little, the internet got a little wobbly, so I think we can just let Dan tell us more about what the opportunities are,
sure.
yeah, related to the law and the perspective from a legal expert. Thank you, Dan.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to Senator Murphy, to Senator Murray, congressional staff that are on the call, as well as my co-panelists. These stories are incredible. Not only the personal stories from Julie, Sam, and Victoria, but also what it takes to actually make reduction, elimination of restraint and seclusion in public schools a reality. So I'm very proud and very honored to be here, as well as to be part of the Minnesota Disability Law Center in the National Disability Rights Network. I think one of the main questions before us is, why should these practices be prohibited at a federal level, and why state laws are not sufficient? From my perspective, is that this is fundamentally a civil rights issue, a human rights issue, and something that we have a 20+ year documented history of problems, of injuries, of deaths. We have the Hartford Current Report of 1998. We have the National Disability Rights Network report, Schools Not Supposed to Hurt. We've got the US government accounting offices talking about the problems with restraint and seclusion in our nation's public schools. We also heard from Victoria that restraint and seclusion leads to police involvement. And this impacts not only the kid, but also the student in all sorts of different ways. If it's not hard enough to have disabilities, now you're in a criminal system. I think another important thing to think about when we're talking about a federal law, instead of just a patchwork of state laws, is that right now we have about 10 to 15 states that have no laws whatsoever on restraint and seclusion. That means there are inconsistent definitions across the state on when and how to use restraint and seclusion. This does not help students, it doesn't help staff, it doesn't help the education system, and it certainly doesn't promote education, learning, and progress. There is so much difference in the state laws that we need a floor, a reasonable floor, to take appropriate steps to get to a better place for how to appropriately help out kids, like Sam when he was younger, when Julie he was younger, and like Victoria's son. And I also think it's critical that there are prohibitions on prone restraint, supine restraint, and other restraints that are contraindicated by a student's health. So that's another reason why this law is incredibly needed. It's incredibly important. I would also say that it's important to emphasize that the bill has some funding, some grants for school districts to do what Heidi and Angie are already doing. It's not only the money though, but as Angie and Heidi already said, it's about the buy-in, it's about the culture, it's about the perspective to ensure that kids do not get put into restraints and seclusion. We have alternative tools. We have many other examples in other types of facilities, hospitals, residential facilities, other places that serve youth. They have figured out how to use different types of interventions besides restraint and seclusion. Why not schools? It often strikes me when I hear stories like Julie's, Sam's, and Victoria's about why this is happening. And I think we already got the answer from Heidi and Angie. It's because there's not that culture and not that buy-in. But we also know that kids are in very difficult places, in very difficult spots in their lives because of their disabilities. They need support and they need help. Sometimes restraint is needed, and that's what this bill authorizes. But I think that once we look into the data, and I'll jump into the data piece next, is that the data can help us understand how restraints and seclusion are actually being used. And we can start to see regional differences, state differences, and any types of disparities that seem to be suspect, including based on different types of races, on disabilities, and on ages. If you really look into the data at the state level, where there is some existing data on this, we see extreme racial disparities in the data. And that seems to me that it begs the question about if kids who are African American or Black are being restrained at a higher rate than white students, the fundamental justification for restraint and seclusion is called into question. And I think that by having a nationwide even floor of data, we can really start to understand again why these practices are happening. And that can feed into better ways of understanding what we're actually doing to help out students and their families. And I'll also say that data is a well-known essential continual improvement performance measure. It just makes sense to do that, to really look at the data coming in and to have a better understanding of what it's like. And I think that also helps out staff and teachers and other service providers so that they can see what is going on, not only on an individual level, but on a state, district, classroom level. So people just have that opportunity to understand what's going on and take that second look at what is really going on with the practice of restraint and seclusion. I will get into the last part, one of the main questions here, what would I like Congress to know? I would say that this bill simply makes sense. It made sense 10 years ago, it made sense 15 years ago. It's a good balance between different responsibilities by school districts. It encourages and supports and funds training and other continuous improvement processes to help out. But I think even more importantly, it safeguards the rights of students with disabilities and protects them from unnecessary restraints and seclusion, especially those that involve prone restraint, supine restraint, and other forms of restraint and seclusion that are contraindicated. This bill really sets an important floor for different states to measure against their current practices and against the practices in other states. It is simply important. It provides incentives. This bill provides incentives as well as penalties. It encourages a healthier and safer environment for students to learn, but it also has the dual purpose of helping out staff do the hard work that we know that school teachers and school officials are doing on a day-to-day basis. It's not just the kids' rights, it's how teachers and students can support each other in this very difficult process. And lastly, I'll end by saying that this bill reflects a consensus around established and documented principles that have worked in other ways, in other areas, to keep kids safe and to keep teachers safe. Teachers face harm for engaging in a restraint. This is not fun for them either. I will also emphasize that school staff really don't want to put kids into restraint and seclusion. That's not what they got involved to do. They want to help out kids. So let's give them the tools and techniques to help them do that. And importantly, and this is how I'll end, is that we have a moral, ethical imperative to take action now so we don't have more and more extreme abuses and incidences that harm students and staff. So let's support staff and students by enacting this bill now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone. I think we have definitely touched on many of the points where having the federal bright line is important. It gives a vision of what needs to happen, and states still have latitude on how to implement the training, on how to assure students are safe, but we all need to work together to reduce opposition from the teachers union, as has been discussed in the chat, and to bring in other communities of color on this struggle. I'm going to give Julie and Sam the last word here. If there's anything else you want to share with everybody on how important this is to pass federal legislation, or what it would do to help students. Julie, you want to start?
Sure, yes. So in the chat, while Dan was talking, my good buddy Guy Stevens from the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint wrote that civil rights should not change at the state line. Duh. Dan said that there are 10 to 15 states without laws, but that's not the only issue, because while preparing for this, I rediscovered Pennsylvania Code 14.133, amended in 2008, around the time I was in 4th grade, being restrained and secluded. It mandates positive behavioral support plans and puts some pretty sound regulations for the use of restraint seclusion as a last resort. I was surprised to learn that the code is as old as 2008, because I am living proof that not even the 3rd wealthiest school district in Pennsylvania has the integrity to follow through with it. The enforcement or consideration of state policies at the individual level is why we're here today. It's not enforced. There is no consideration. We need a federal law to create a nationwide standard, like Dan said, because right now, if there is a nationwide standard, it's allowing for the systematic torture of children. A federal law is the only way to protect all children from this trauma. And those of you who are watching now or in the future who have any doubts, the inconsistency at the state level means that any of your children's teacher can interpret your child's behavior, no matter who they are, as an imminent threat to their safety, restrain and seclude them, and get away with it. So this law is the only way to keep every single student safe, including your own.
Absolutely. Very well. Sam?
Well, I really hope that this bill can keep students and kids safe in schools, because I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. It was horrible. It should have never happened, but it happened. But I am here today to tell about my story. And thank you everyone here for telling your story, including Alexander. Oh, she's still here. Victoria and Julie and everyone else here. Thank you so much. You know, Victoria's story put a tear to my eye. I'm sorry to hear what happened to your son. It reminds me of my story. You know, it's very similar, and that's the stuff that like scares me. That like kids in schools should never ever under any circumstance should go through this whatsoever. As it was students of color, students with disabilities, anybody, even kids in school, they should never go through this at all.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for being here today, for sharing your story and your wisdom. I look forward to working with you all to pass this bill, and to everyone that tuned in. Again, thank you. Talk at your state level to your elected officials. Talk to your teachers, get them to put some pressure on their state teachers unions, because often that's where the federal teachers unions get their policy from, the pressure from the states. So keep up the good work, and we'll hope to pass this soon. Thank you again. This has been recorded, and we will share the link so that others may post it and share as well. So thanks, everybody.